Frank Patterson's weathered hands froze on the steel trap's mechanism, blood streaming down his forearms as 5 lionesses circled closer. The massive male lion beneath him drew a shuddering breath that might be his last. This wasn't supposed to be how a dying man spent his final months. Margaret's scream pierced the Kenyan twilight as Marcus Vanderberg's rifle barrel glinted in the fading light, trained directly at Frank's silver head. The elderly tour guide stumbled backward, her binoculars clattering against the acacia roots. 6 months ago, Frank had been planning Martha's funeral flowers, not kneeling in African dirt, trying to save a beast that could kill him with one swipe. The wedding ring on his trembling finger caught the last rays of sunlight. 47 years of marriage reduced to this moment of insanity. "Step away from that animal, old man." Marcus's voice cracked with barely controlled rage. How had a Nebraska farmer's promise to his dying wife led him here? And would anyone survive long enough to understand why? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Frank Patterson had stood in the same Omaha cemetery where he'd buried his parents, his brother, and now his wife of 47 years. The Nebraska wind cut through his black suit as he stared at Martha's fresh headstone, still smelling of wet concrete and unfulfilled promises. At 72, he'd survived 2 tours in Vietnam, 40 years of farming and a dozen hospital visits, but watching cancer steal his Martha had broken something inside him that all the wars couldn't touch. The farmhouse felt like a mausoleum now. Every morning, Frank still brewed 2 cups of coffee out of habit, letting the second one grow cold on Martha's side of the kitchen table. Her reading glasses remained folded on the nightstand next to a half-finished crossword puzzle, and her garden tools hung in the barn exactly where she'd left them last spring. Friends from church had stopped calling after the 3rd month of his gruff responses, and even Pastor Williams had given up on the weekly visits. 3,000 miles away in Boston, Dr. Jennifer Patterson Collins was drowning in her own form of grief. The prestigious cardiac surgery position she'd fought 12 years to achieve now felt hollow without her mother's proud phone calls after each successful operation. Her recent divorce from Robert had left her raising 12-year-old Tyler alone, and the custody battles consumed every spare moment she might have used to process her mother's death. When Tyler asked why Grandpa Frank never visited anymore, Jennifer found herself making excuses that tasted like ash in her mouth. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when Tyler called his grandfather directly, something Jennifer had been discouraging. She found her son crying in his bedroom afterward, clutching his tablet where Frank's weathered face had disappeared mid-conversation. "Grandpa just hung up when I asked about Grandma's garden," Tyler sobbed into her scrubs. "He said some things are too broken to fix." That night, Jennifer called Frank for the first time in 2 months. The conversation lasted exactly 4 minutes and ended with Frank's declaration that he was fine managing alone and didn't need city folks telling him how to grieve. When she suggested he consider assisted living near Boston, the line went dead. She tried calling back 3 times, but the phone rang unanswered in the empty farmhouse. What Jennifer didn't know was that Frank had spent that same evening sitting in Dr. Reynolds' office, staring at X-rays that showed shadows where there should have been clear tissue. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, 3 to 6 months if he was lucky. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd survived bullets and Agent Orange only to be felled by his own rebellious cells. As he drove home past cornfields that would soon belong to someone else, Frank made 2 decisions. He wouldn't burden Jennifer with another death, and he'd honor Martha's last coherent words. "Find something beautiful to believe in again, Frank. Don't just wait to die." The Kenya brochure had been Martha's, tucked inside her favorite cookbook like a prayer. The call came at 2:47 a.m. Boston time, jarring Jennifer from the first decent sleep she'd managed in weeks. Tyler's fevered mumblings about a school project had kept her up until midnight, and the emergency cardiac surgery she'd performed the day before still had her hands aching. The caller ID showed her father's bank, and her heart immediately assumed the worst. Stroke, heart attack, maybe he'd finally given up entirely. Dr. Patterson Collins, this is regarding your father's account activity. We're required to notify next of kin about significant transactions. The banker's voice carried that practiced sympathy reserved for family members of elderly clients. Your father withdrew $37,000 yesterday and purchased an international travel package to Kenya. Given his age and the amount, we wanted to ensure this wasn't fraudulent activity. Jennifer sat bolt upright, suddenly wide awake. Kenya? Are you certain? She padded to her laptop, hands shaking as she pulled up her father's information. Frank had never traveled further than Omaha since his military service, and the idea of him booking international travel felt as surreal as discovering he'd joined the circus. The transaction went through yesterday afternoon. Mr. Patterson seemed quite determined when he visited our branch. He also liquidated his farming equipment investment account. The banker paused. Ma'am, is your father experiencing any cognitive issues we should be aware of? After hanging up, Jennifer immediately called Frank's landline. It rang 12 times before going to the ancient answering machine Martha had insisted on keeping. His gravelly voice, recorded probably a decade ago, asked callers to leave a message. She tried his cell phone next, but it went straight to voicemail. Frank had never figured out how to charge the thing properly. By morning, Jennifer had contacted 3 neighbors, the local sheriff and Pastor Williams. All reported the same thing. Frank's truck was gone, his mailbox was full, and old Henry Kowalski from the next farm over had seen Frank loading suitcases 2 days prior. Thought maybe he was finally moving to be near you folks in Boston, Henry had told her over the phone. Didn't seem like my business to ask. The Kenya Tour Company confirmed the booking when Jennifer finally tracked them down. Mr. Patterson specifically requested our 14-day wildlife photography expedition, the cheerful booking agent explained. He mentioned wanting to honor his late wife's memory. Very touching, really. He's scheduled to depart from Omaha in 6 days. Jennifer's hands trembled as she hung up. Her father, who complained about driving to the grocery store in town, had booked a trip to Africa. The man who'd barely spoken to her since Martha's funeral was planning to disappear to another continent without telling anyone. The guilt hit her like a physical blow. While she'd been consumed with custody battles and surgery schedules, Frank had been planning what felt suspiciously like an elaborate form of suicide. She called in sick for the first time in 3 years and booked the next flight to Omaha. Tyler would stay with Robert for the weekend, something that would undoubtedly fuel another custody argument, but she couldn't care about that now. During the 2-hour flight, she rehearsed conversations that ranged from gentle coercion to legal intervention. She even researched involuntary psychiatric holds for elderly patients showing signs of cognitive decline. Frank's farmhouse looked smaller than she remembered, somehow diminished without Martha's flower beds and vegetable garden. The front porch sagged slightly, and paint peeled from the shutters in a way that would have horrified her mother. When Frank answered the door, Jennifer barely recognized him. He'd lost at least 20 pounds, his clothes hung loose, and his eyes held a hollowness that reminded her uncomfortably of terminal patients who'd given up fighting. Jennifer. He didn't sound surprised to see her, just resigned. I suppose the bank called. Dad, what the hell are you thinking? The words came out harsher than she'd intended, years of suppressed frustration boiling over. Kenya? You've never even been on an airplane since Vietnam, and now you're planning some kind of African safari? Frank stepped aside to let her in, but his posture remained defensive. The house smelled stale, like grief and neglect. Martha's coffee cup still sat in the sink, unwashed. Your mother always wanted to see the wildlife there. Kept a whole scrapbook of pictures. Mom's gone, Dad. This won't bring her back. Jennifer's voice cracked despite her determination to stay strong. And what about Tyler? What about me? Were you planning to just disappear without saying goodbye? Frank's jaw tightened, that familiar, stubborn set she remembered from childhood arguments. I'm not your responsibility, Jennifer. You've made that clear enough these past months. The accusation hit harder than any physical blow, because it was partially true, and they both knew it. The argument that followed would haunt Jennifer for months afterward. Frank stood in Martha's kitchen, his back rigid against the counter where his wife had prepared 47 years of meals and refused to budge on the Kenya trip. Jennifer paced between the dining room and living room, her voice rising with each failed attempt at reason. You're 72 years old, Dad. You have high blood pressure, arthritis in both knees, and you haven't been to a doctor since Mom's funeral. What happens if you have a medical emergency in the middle of the African bush? She gestured wildly at the travel brochures scattered across Martha's kitchen table. Look at this itinerary: camping, hiking, photographing dangerous animals. This isn't a vacation, it's a death wish. Frank's weathered hands gripped the counter behind him. Maybe that's the point. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Jennifer stopped pacing, her medical training immediately recognizing the signs she'd been too angry to see clearly. The weight loss, the isolation, the reckless planning. Her father wasn't just grieving. He was actively giving up. Dad, listen to me. We can get you help. There are grief counselors, support groups, medications that can... I don't want help. Frank's voice was quiet but final. I want to do this one thing for Martha, and then I want to be left alone. Jennifer sank into Martha's chair at the kitchen table, the same spot where her mother had paid bills, written letters, and planned family gatherings. The wood was worn smooth from decades of use, and she could almost feel her mother's presence in the grain. What about Tyler? He adores you. He asks about you every day, Dad. He's already lost his grandmother. How can you take away his grandfather, too? For the first time, Frank's composure cracked. His eyes, so much like her own, filled with tears he'd been holding back for months. That boy deserves better than watching another old fool waste away. Better than sitting in some hospital room while machines keep me breathing. The words hit Jennifer like a diagnosis she should have seen coming. What aren't you telling me? Frank turned toward the window, staring out at Martha's abandoned garden where weeds now choked the tomato plants. The silence stretched between them until Jennifer thought she might scream. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 3 months, maybe 6 if I'm lucky. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Same thing that got your mother, just faster. He didn't turn around. I won't put you through that again, Jennifer. I won't make you watch another parent die by inches in some sterile hospital room. Jennifer's world tilted sideways. Her medical mind immediately began calculating survival rates, treatment options, clinical trials, while her daughter's heart simply shattered. When? When did you find out? 2 weeks after Martha's funeral. Been keeping it to myself since. Frank finally turned to face her, and she saw the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Dr. Reynolds wanted to start treatment immediately, but I've seen what that looks like. The chemo, the radiation, the false hope. Martha fought for 18 months and suffered every day. I won't do that to myself. And I won't do it to you. That's not your choice to make alone. Jennifer's voice broke completely now, years of controlled emotion finally spilling over. I'm a doctor, Dad. I could have helped you research options, gotten second opinions, connected you with specialists. Instead, you decided to sneak off to Africa to die like some kind of wounded animal. Frank's jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. I'm not going there to die. I'm going there to live for whatever time I have left. Martha spent 40 years dreaming about seeing those lions and elephants, reading every National Geographic, planning a trip we never took because there was always something more practical to do with the money. Well, practical can go to hell. I'm taking her ashes to see those lions. The revelation hit Jennifer like another blow. She'd wondered why Frank had insisted on cremation when Martha had always talked about being buried next to her parents. "You're taking Mom with you." "In a small container, yes. Figured I'd scatter some of her ashes somewhere beautiful, somewhere she always wanted to see. Maybe bring the rest home. Maybe not." Frank's voice softened slightly. "The tour company says the Masai Mara has the most lions in the world. Martha would have loved that." Jennifer buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by the impossible situation. Her father was dying, planning what amounted to an elaborate goodbye tour, and she'd been too caught up in her own life to notice any of it. The guilt was crushing, but so was the love, and so was the terror of losing both parents within a year. "I could come with you," she said quietly. "Take a leave of absence, arrange for Tyler to stay with Robert. We could do this together." Frank's expression softened for the first time since she'd arrived. "No, sweetheart. You've got your own life to live, and Tyler needs his mother here. This is something I need to do alone for Martha and for me. But what if something happens? What if you get sick over there or hurt or—" "Then I'll deal with it when it happens. Jennifer, I've spent 6 months feeling sorry for myself, rattling around this empty house like a ghost. For the first time since Martha died, I have something that feels like a purpose. Don't take that away from me." Outside, the Nebraska wind rattled the windows of the house where Jennifer had grown up, where her parents had built a life together, where her mother had died and her father was now planning his own ending. She realized with a clarity that hurt to acknowledge that she couldn't stop him, and maybe she shouldn't try. 3 weeks later, Frank Patterson stood in the departure lounge at Omaha's Eppley Airfield, clutching a boarding pass that felt like both a liberation and a death sentence. The small urn containing half of Martha's ashes was carefully wrapped in his carry-on bag, along with 47 years' worth of photographs and the letter he'd sealed for Jennifer, to be opened only if he didn't return. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the pill organizer in his jacket pocket, filled with enough pain medication to get him through 2 weeks, maybe longer if he was careful about dosing. The flight to Nairobi felt endless. 36 hours of connections through Chicago and Amsterdam that left Frank disoriented and nauseated. He'd never been good with air travel, even in his military days, and age hadn't improved his tolerance for turbulence and recycled air. By the time he reached Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, he was running on pure, stubborn determination, and the 2 energy drinks a concerned flight attendant had pressed on him during the final leg. His tour group was smaller than expected. Just 7 other travelers gathered around a hand-lettered sign reading, "Mara Dreams Safari." Margaret Henley, a 70-year-old widow from Portland, immediately took Frank under her wing with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing details. "First time to Africa?" she asked, noting his overwhelmed expression as porters shouted in languages he didn't recognize. "I came here 30 years ago with my Harold. Always promised myself I'd come back after he passed." The drive from Nairobi to the Masai Mara took 6 hours on roads that seemed designed to test every joint in Frank's arthritic body. Their guide, Samuel, a soft-spoken Kenyan in his 40s, pointed out landmarks and wildlife with practiced enthusiasm, but Frank found himself drifting in and out of focus as his medication wore off. The landscape was everything Martha had described from her National Geographic magazines: vast golden grasslands dotted with acacia trees, distant mountains shrouded in clouds, and a sky so enormous it made Nebraska seem claustrophobic. On their second day, Frank experienced his first real wildlife encounter. A herd of elephants crossed the dirt road in front of their vehicle. massive matriarchs leading babies that couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. The tour group fell silent as the giants passed within arm's reach, their ancient eyes briefly acknowledging the humans before moving on. Frank felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the grief that had been crushing him for months. For the first time since Martha's death, he could imagine her sitting beside him, whispering facts about elephant family structures and conservation efforts. That evening at camp, Margaret cornered him during dinner. "You're not here for the standard tour, are you?" she asked quietly, spooning lukewarm stew that tasted like dust and hope. "I've seen that look before. Harold had it right before he died, like he was already seeing something the rest of us couldn't." Frank studied the elderly woman's weathered face, recognizing a kindred spirit in her direct gaze. "My wife always wanted to see lions, real ones, in the wild. She collected pictures of them for 40 years, never got the chance to make the trip. And you're here to see them for her." Margaret nodded with understanding. "Where is she now?" Frank patted his jacket pocket where the small urn rested. "Close by." The morning of the third day changed everything. Frank had woken before dawn with the worst pain he'd experienced since his diagnosis, the cancer gnawing at his insides like a living thing. He'd doubled his medication dosage, knowing it would leave him groggy but desperate for relief. When Samuel announced they'd be tracking a pride of lions that had been spotted near the Mara River, Frank forced himself to join the group despite his weakness. The pride was magnificent, one massive male with a dark mane and 5 females sprawled in the shade of a massive acacia tree. The male, who Samuel called Mafalma, was clearly the dominant force, his scarred face and powerful build speaking to years of successful leadership. The lionesses were equally impressive, lean and alert even in their apparent rest. Frank found himself separated from the group as they positioned themselves for photographs, drawn by an inexplicable urge to get closer to these creatures that had dominated Martha's dreams. He was perhaps 50 yards from the main group when he heard the mechanical snap that would haunt his nightmares, if he lived long enough to have them. The sound was followed immediately by a roar of pain and fury that seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. Mafalme had stepped into a trap, a massive steel contraption designed for much larger prey. The lion's massive paw was caught in serrated jaws that bit deep into bone and sinew, and his attempts to free himself only made the wounds worse. Frank's military training kicked in before his rational mind could intervene. He'd seen plenty of traps in Vietnam, knew how they worked and how they could be disarmed. This one was clearly meant for rhinos or elephants, far too powerful for any lion to escape alone. The 5 lionesses had surrounded their leader, pacing and growling with increasing agitation as his struggles weakened. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, pulling out his cell phone to call Samuel. The device showed no signal. They were too far from any towers. The tour group was at least 10 minutes away on foot, and Mafalme was bleeding badly enough that he might not survive that long. Frank looked at the urn in his jacket, thinking of Martha's voice during their last coherent conversation. "Find something beautiful to believe in again, Frank." He began walking toward the lions. The approach was the longest 50 yards of Frank's life. Every step sent lightning bolts of cancer pain through his abdomen, but he forced himself to move slowly and deliberately. The 5 lionesses noticed him immediately, their heads swiveling in his direction with predatory focus. 2 of them began moving to flank him, cutting off potential escape routes with the coordination of apex predators. "Easy, ladies," Frank said quietly, his voice surprisingly steady despite the circumstances. "I'm not here to hurt anybody. Just want to help your boy there." Mafalme's eyes met Frank's across the 30 yards that separated them, and something impossible passed between man and beast. The lion stopped struggling, his massive head tilting slightly as if considering this strange human who dared approach his moment of vulnerability. Frank had read enough of Martha's animal books to know that lions didn't typically attack unless they felt threatened or were protecting their young, but he also knew that a wounded animal was unpredictable. 20 yards. The lionesses were close enough now that Frank could hear their breathing, see the tension in their shoulders as they prepared for whatever came next. His hands shook as he pulled out the small toolkit he always carried, a habit from his farming days when everything was always breaking down and needed immediate repair. "That's quite a mess you've gotten yourself into," Frank continued talking, more to calm his own nerves than any belief that the lions understood him. "Reminds me of the time I got my foot caught in a hay baler. Hurt like hell, but I got out of it eventually." 10 yards. Mafalme was watching him intently now, his golden eyes never leaving Frank's face. The trap was even worse up close, military-grade steel with enough force to crush bone. Someone had invested serious money and effort into this killing machine, which meant they'd be back to check on their catch. Frank guessed he had maybe 30 minutes before the trappers returned. 5 yards. Frank knelt slowly, his joints protesting every movement. The pain medication was wearing off, leaving him lightheaded and nauseated, but he forced himself to focus on the mechanical problem in front of him. Traps like this had a release mechanism, usually a spring-loaded system that could be triggered if you knew where to apply pressure. The lionesses were close enough to touch now, their bodies radiating heat and power. Frank could smell their wild scent, musky and dangerous, and completely alien to anything in his Nebraska experience. One of them, a female with distinctive scars across her left shoulder, approached to within arm's reach and sat down as if to supervise his work. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank muttered, running his hands along the trap's mechanism. "You ladies are something else." That's when he heard the distant sound of an approaching vehicle, and his blood turned to ice. The trappers were returning early. The engine noise grew louder as Frank's arthritic fingers worked frantically at the trap's release mechanism. His military engineering training from 40 years ago came flooding back. Find the pressure point, release the spring tension, work fast before the enemy arrives. Except this time, the enemy wasn't Viet Cong soldiers, and Frank wasn't a 20-year-old Marine with steady hands and unlimited time. Mfalme seemed to sense the approaching danger, his massive head turning toward the sound while remaining perfectly still as Frank worked. The 5 lionesses had positioned themselves in a protective semicircle, their attention split between the struggling human and whatever was coming through the bush. Frank had never imagined he'd find himself in a situation where lions were his allies, but Martha had always said life had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. The jeep that emerged from the acacia grove was military surplus, painted in faded camouflage and mounted with equipment that spoke of serious hunting operations. The man who stepped out was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that came from years under the African sun. He carried a high-powered rifle with the casual competence of someone who'd used it frequently, and his eyes immediately assessed the bizarre tableau before him. An elderly American kneeling beside a trapped lion while being watched by 5 potential killers. "Step away from that animal immediately," the man called out in accented English. South African, Frank guessed. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Frank didn't look up from his work, though sweat was now pouring down his face from both exertion and medication withdrawal. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with. Some coward's trap that's about to kill a magnificent animal for no good reason." The hunter approached slowly, rifle trained not on Frank but on the lionesses, who had begun to show signs of agitation at this new threat. "That magnificent animal killed my 8-year-old son 3 years ago, tore him apart while I watched from 50 yards away, too far to help, too close to forget." The words hit Frank like a physical blow, but he kept working at the trap mechanism. He could feel it beginning to give way under his ministrations, the spring tension starting to release. "I'm sorry for your loss, son. Truly. But killing this lion won't bring your boy back." "Marcus Vanderberg," the hunter said, as if introducing himself might somehow legitimize what was about to happen. "And you're wrong, old man. Every lion I kill makes the world a little safer for other children." Frank finally looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes across the 20 feet that separated them. What he saw there wasn't malice or cruelty, but a pain so deep it had transformed into something else entirely. A mission, a crusade, a reason to keep breathing when everything else had been taken away. It was a look Frank recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror for months after Martha's death. "My name's Frank Patterson. Lost my wife 6 months ago to cancer. Been wanting to die myself ever since." Frank's voice was steady despite the lion's hot breath on his arm as Mafalmi shifted position. "Came here to scatter her ashes somewhere beautiful, maybe not make it back home." Marcus's rifle wavered slightly. "Then you understand. You know what it's like to lose everything that matters." "I do." Frank felt the trap mechanism give another inch, almost there now. "But I also know that letting grief turn you into something your boy wouldn't recognize isn't going to honor his memory." "Don't you dare talk about my son." Marcus's voice cracked with barely controlled emotion. "You don't know anything about Jake, about what he meant to me, about how he died?" Frank paused in his work, studying the younger man's face. "Tell me about him then. Tell me about Jake." The request seemed to catch Marcus off guard. His rifle lowered slightly as something shifted in his expression, the hardened hunter replaced momentarily by a grieving father. He wanted to be a veterinarian, spent hours drawing pictures of animals, reading books about conservation, said he was going to come to Africa someday and help protect the lions. The irony wasn't lost on Frank, and he could see from Marcus's face that it wasn't lost on him either. "Sounds like a good boy, smart boy." "The best." Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper now. "We were camping, just the two of us. Father-son trip. I'd set up our tents near a watering hole, thought it would be safe. Lions usually avoid humans if they're not threatened, but this one..." He gestured at Mfalmi with his rifle barrel. "This one was different, aggressive, territorial. Jake was just filling our water bottles when it happened." Frank's hands had stopped working while he listened, but now he resumed his careful manipulation of the trap mechanism. "How do you know it was this specific lion?" "The scar on his left flank. Distinctive mark from an old territory fight. I've been tracking him for 3 years, waiting for the right opportunity." Marcus raised his rifle again, but his aim seemed less steady than before. "I've already taken 4 females from his pride. Tonight I finish what he started." The admission sent a chill through Frank that had nothing to do with his medication withdrawal. 4 females. This isn't about justice, son. This is about revenge. Call it whatever you want. Those females won't be having cubs that grow up to kill other children. Marcus's finger moved to the trigger. "And neither will he." That's when Frank felt the trap mechanism finally give way completely. With a sharp metallic click, the steel jaws sprang open, releasing Mafalmi's mangled paw. The lion immediately surged to his feet, a roar of relief and fury that seemed to shake the earth itself. Blood streamed from his wounded leg, but he was mobile, dangerous, and very much alive. The 5 lionesses reacted instantly, moving to flank their leader while keeping themselves between the humans and any potential threat. Marcus swung his rifle toward Mfalmi, but Frank was already moving, throwing himself between the hunter and the lion despite every instinct screaming at him to run. "Don't do it, Marcus. Not like this. Get out of my way, old man. This doesn't concern you." Frank spread his arms wide, making himself as large a target as possible. His cancer-weakened body would be no match for a rifle bullet, but maybe it would buy Mafalmi enough time to escape with his pride. It concerns anyone who believes that healing is better than killing. Healing? Marcus laughed bitterly. You think this is about healing? My son is dead. My wife killed herself a year later because she couldn't live with the guilt of surviving when Jake didn't. There is no healing from that. Your wife killed herself? Frank felt something shift in his understanding of the man before him. Jesus, son, you've lost everything. Everything. Marcus's voice broke completely now, years of suppressed grief finally spilling over. Sarah couldn't forgive herself for not being there, for letting me take Jake on that trip alone. She hung herself in our garage while I was out hunting the lions that killed our boy. Left me a note saying she was going to find him, that they'd be waiting for me when I finished my mission. Frank's heart broke for this broken man, this father who'd let grief transform him into something unrecognizable. Behind him, he could hear Mafalme's labored breathing as the lion struggled to stay upright on his injured leg. The pride was getting restless, torn between protecting their leader and avoiding the humans who represented unknown danger. Marcus, listen to me. I know about losing a spouse. I know about wanting to follow them into whatever comes next. But this isn't the way. It's the only way I know. Marcus raised his rifle again, but his hands were shaking now. 3 years I've been planning this moment. 3 years of tracking, learning their patterns, setting traps. I can't stop now. I won't stop now. Frank could feel his strength beginning to fail as his medication wore off completely. The pain in his abdomen was becoming unbearable, and his vision was starting to blur around the edges. But he held his ground, thinking of Martha's voice during their last conversation. Find something beautiful to believe in again. Maybe this was it. Maybe standing between grief and vengeance, between death and life, was the most beautiful thing he could do with whatever time he had left. The standoff stretched into agonizing seconds as Frank swayed on his feet, his body finally succumbing to the cancer that had been eating away at him for months. The pain medication had completely worn off now, leaving him defenseless against the disease that was killing him as surely as Marcus's rifle could. Behind him, Mafalme's breathing grew more labored, blood pooling beneath his injured paw as the massive lion struggled to remain standing. You're dying, Marcus said suddenly, his hunter's eye recognizing the signs that Frank had been trying to hide. Cancer? Frank nodded, not trusting his voice as another wave of agony swept through his abdomen. Pancreatic. 3 months, maybe 6. Then why are you doing this? Why throw away whatever time you have left for an animal that would kill you without hesitation? Because. Frank's voice came out as a whisper, but he forced himself to continue. Because my wife spent 40 years dreaming about seeing lions in the wild. Because she died believing there was still beauty in the world worth fighting for. Because maybe if I can save one magnificent creature, I can prove she was right. Marcus's rifle wavered, confusion replacing certainty in his eyes. Your wife is dead. This won't bring her back any more than killing this lion will bring back my Jake. No, but it might honor her memory, might make her death mean something beyond just another tragedy. Frank felt his knees beginning to buckle but forced himself to remain upright. What would Jake think if he could see you now? Would he be proud of what his father has become? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. His rifle dropped several inches as his face contorted with pain that had nothing to do with physical injury. Jake loved animals. He made me promise to take him to a zoo for his 9th birthday. Wanted to see the big cats, learn about conservation. And instead, you're here killing the very animals he wanted to protect. They killed him! Marcus's voice broke completely, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. That beast behind you tore my son apart while he was just trying to get water. 8 years old, and he died screaming for his daddy to save him. Frank's heart shattered for this broken man, but he held his ground even as his vision began to blur. I know. I can't imagine that pain. But Marcus, look around you. This lion has a family too. Those 5 females depend on him for protection. If you kill him, you're creating more orphans, more loss. Behind Frank, one of the lionesses, the scarred female who had been watching him work on the trap, stepped forward. She moved slowly, deliberately, until she was standing directly beside the wounded human. Her massive head came up to Frank's shoulder, and for a moment that defied all logic and survival instinct. She rested her weight against him, as if offering support to this strange creature who had freed their leader. Marcus stared in disbelief at the unprecedented scene before him. That's not possible. Lions don't behave that way with humans. Maybe they do when they recognize kindness. Frank's hand, moving without conscious thought, settled on the lioness's head. Her fur was coarser than he'd expected, warm and alive beneath his fingers. Maybe they understand more than we give them credit for. The other lionesses began to move then, not in attack formation, but in what could only be described as protective positioning. They formed a semicircle around Frank and their injured leader, facing Marcus but not advancing. It was as if they recognized that this particular human had helped rather than harmed, and they were willing to extend their protection to him. Frank felt his strength finally give out completely. His knees buckled and he collapsed to the ground, his body unable to fight both cancer and the adrenaline crash any longer. The lioness beside him remained steady, her presence somehow comforting as darkness began to close in around his vision. "Please," he whispered, looking up at Marcus through eyes that were starting to lose focus. "Don't let my wife down. Don't let Jake down. Choose healing over vengeance." Marcus stood frozen, his rifle still raised but his face a mask of anguish and confusion. The scene before him challenged everything he thought he knew about lions, about justice, about the mission that had consumed 3 years of his life. A dying man surrounded by the very predators Marcus had sworn to eliminate. Yet the animals showed no aggression, only what appeared to be compassion. That's when Frank's phone began to ring, the sound impossibly loud in the African silence. The caller ID, visible even from Marcus's distance, showed a single word: Jennifer. "Answer it," Marcus said suddenly. "Answer your phone." Frank's hands shook as he fumbled for the device, his coordination failing as his body shut down. The lioness beside him seemed to understand his distress, nuzzling the phone closer to his reach with her massive head, another impossibility in a day full of them. "Dad? Dad, are you there?" Jennifer's voice came through the speaker, tinged with panic and exhaustion. "I've been trying to reach you for hours. The tour company said you missed the evening check-in." "Jennifer," Frank managed, his voice barely audible. "I'm here, sweetheart. You sound terrible. Are you sick? Are you taking your medication?" The concern in her voice was palpable, carrying across thousands of miles of ocean and continent. "Dad, I know you're angry with me, but please don't shut me out." "Not now." Frank closed his eyes, feeling the lioness's warmth against his side and hearing his daughter's voice from another world entirely. "I'm not angry, honey. I was never angry. I was just scared." "Scared of what?" "Of being a burden. Of watching you watch me die the way we watched your mother die." Frank's confession came out in halting words, each one an effort. "I wanted to spare you that pain." "Oh, Dad," Jennifer's voice broke completely. "You could never be a burden. You're my father, Tyler's grandfather. We love you and we want to help you fight this." Marcus lowered his rifle completely, the weapon hanging forgotten at his side as he listened to the conversation between father and daughter. Something in Frank's words resonated with his own memories of Jake, of the bond between parent and child that transcended everything else. "I don't know how much fight I have left," Frank admitted. The cancer's winning, Jenny. But I'm here, in Africa, surrounded by the most beautiful creatures your mother ever dreamed of seeing. And maybe that's enough." "No, it's not enough." Jennifer's voice rose with desperation. "I'm booking a flight right now. I'm coming to get you, Dad. Don't you dare give up on me." Frank looked up at Marcus, seeing his own reflection in the younger man's haunted eyes. Two fathers, both destroyed by loss, both struggling to find meaning in the wreckage of their lives. "Marcus," he said quietly, "what would Jake want you to do right now?" Marcus stared at the dying man surrounded by lions, at the impossible scene of interspecies compassion, at everything that challenged his 3-year mission of revenge. When he spoke, his voice was that of a broken father rather than a hardened hunter. "He'd want me to help you. Jake always wanted to help hurt animals." Marcus slung his rifle across his shoulder and pulled out his own phone. "I'm calling for medical evacuation. There's a veterinary clinic 30 minutes from here that treats both wildlife and humans in emergencies." As Marcus made the call, Frank felt consciousness slipping away. The last thing he saw was Mafalme, still standing despite his injuries, watching over the strange gathering with golden eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. The last thing he felt was the lioness's steady presence beside him, a wild creature offering comfort to a dying man who had chosen compassion over fear. The last thing he heard was Jennifer's voice, thousands of miles away, but somehow close enough to touch. "Hold on, Dad. I'm coming. Just hold on." Frank drifted in and out of consciousness during the helicopter ride to Nairobi, his fevered mind mixing reality with morphine-induced dreams where Martha sat beside him, her hand cool against his forehead. The medical team worked frantically around him, their voices a distant hum as they fought to stabilize his rapidly deteriorating condition. Through the helicopter's window he caught glimpses of the Kenyan landscape rushing by, the same golden grasslands where Mafalme and his pride roamed, where an impossible moment of connection had changed everything. The Nairobi hospital smelled of disinfectant and desperation, sterile corridors that reminded Frank too much of Martha's final weeks. Dr. Amara Ochieng, the attending physician, was a small woman with kind eyes who spoke in precise accented English as she explained Frank's condition to the American consulate official who had arrived to handle the international medical emergency. "Mr. Patterson is in stage 4 pancreatic cancer, far more advanced than his medical records from Nebraska indicated," Dr. Ochieng explained as Frank fought through the fog of pain medication. "The stress of his adventure has accelerated the disease's progression significantly. We're looking at days, perhaps a week or two, with aggressive treatment." Frank tried to speak, to tell them about the lions, about Marcus, about the moment when species barriers had dissolved into something approaching grace, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he squeezed the small urn containing Martha's ashes, which a nurse had thoughtfully placed in his hands. Half of his wife's remains were still with him. The other half was scattered beneath an acacia tree, where a wounded lion had trusted a dying man enough to accept help. Jennifer arrived 18 hours later, her usually composed physician's demeanor shattered by exhaustion and fear. She burst into Frank's room like a force of nature, still wearing surgical scrubs from the emergency she'd abandoned in Boston, her red-rimmed eyes scanning the monitors and IV lines with professional assessment before focusing on her father's gaunt face. "Dad," she whispered, taking his hand in both of hers. "What were you thinking? The tour guide said you wandered off alone, that they found you unconscious surrounded by lions. The story doesn't make any sense." Frank's voice was barely audible when he finally managed to speak. "It made sense at the time. Martha, she would have understood. Mom would have understood you nearly getting yourself killed by wild animals." Jennifer's voice cracked with exhaustion and disbelief. "Dad, The doctors say the cancer has spread to your liver, your lungs. Why didn't you tell me it was this advanced?" Before Frank could answer, there was a commotion in the hallway outside. Raised voices, someone arguing with hospital security, the sound of boots on polished floors. The door opened to reveal Marcus Vanderberg, still dust-covered from the savannah, being escorted by two security guards who clearly didn't know what to make of this armed man demanding to see an American patient. "It's all right," Frank said weakly. "Let him in." Jennifer stared in confusion as Marcus approached the bed, his rifle now absent but his face still bearing the marks of 3 years' worth of grief and purpose. "Mr. Patterson, I wanted to check on your condition before I left Kenya." "Who are you?" Jennifer demanded, her protective instincts immediately activated. "Are you the tour guide? What happened out there?" Marcus looked between father and daughter, seeing in Jennifer's fierce love the same desperation he'd felt watching Jake slip away. "I'm the man your father saved today." In more ways than one, the story that emerged over the next hour challenged everything Jennifer thought she understood about her father's trip to Kenya. Marcus told it in halting sentences, his voice breaking when he described Jake's death, Sarah's suicide, his 3-year mission of vengeance that had led him to that moment when Frank chose to stand between a rifle and a wounded lion. "Your father could have died," Marcus said, his eyes never leaving Frank's face. "Should have died by any reasonable measure. Those lions should have torn him apart the moment he approached. But instead—" He paused, struggling with words for something that defied explanation. "Instead, they protected him, like they knew he was trying to help." Jennifer's medical training rebelled against the implications of the story, but the look in Marcus's eyes was too raw, too honest to be fabrication. "Lions don't behave that way with humans." "It's not possible." "I've been hunting in Africa for 15 years, Marcus replied. "I know what's possible and what isn't. What happened today shouldn't have been possible. But I watched it happen." Frank stirred, his medication-clouded mind struggling to focus on the conversation. "The lioness, the one with scars on her shoulder. She stayed with me, felt like Martha, somehow, like she was saying goodbye." Marcus nodded slowly. "That female has been with Mafalme's pride for 8 years. She's never shown anything but aggression toward humans. Today, she acted like she was protecting you." The revelation hung in the sterile hospital air like a challenge to everything rational, everything scientifically explainable. Jennifer, trained in the rigorous logic of cardiac surgery, found herself confronting something that existed outside the boundaries of medical understanding. "There's something else," Marcus continued, pulling out his phone to show a video he'd recorded after the medical helicopter had taken Frank away. "Something you need to see." The video showed Mfalme, his wounded leg bandaged by the veterinary team that had arrived with the medical evacuation. The massive lion was standing beneath the acacia tree where Frank had freed him, surrounded by his pride. But what made Jennifer's breath catch was what happened next. All 5 lionesses approached the tree where Frank had collapsed, sniffing the ground where he had lain, before lying down in a protective circle around the spot. "They're still there," Marcus said quietly. "It's been 18 hours and they haven't left. The veterinary team says they've never seen behavior like this." Frank's eyes filled with tears as he watched the video, Martha's voice echoing in his memory. Find something beautiful to believe in again. He had found it, in the most impossible place imaginable, in the trust of wild creatures who had every reason to fear and hate humans, but who had chosen compassion instead. "I need to tell you something," Frank said, his voice stronger than it had been since arriving at the hospital. "About your mother. About why she really wanted to come to Kenya." Jennifer leaned closer, sensing the importance of whatever her father was about to reveal. Marcus, understanding that this was a moment for family, moved toward the door, but Frank stopped him with a weak gesture. "Stay! You're part of this story now." Frank's revelation came slowly, punctuated by pauses for breath and medication adjustments. 45 years earlier, Martha had spent a summer in Kenya as part of her graduate studies in wildlife biology. She had worked with the early conservation efforts in the Masai Mara, documenting lion behavior and helping establish the protected areas that still existed today. She had never spoken much about that summer, claiming it was just research for a degree she never finished. But she kept all the photographs, Frank continued. Boxes of them in the attic, pictures of lions, elephants, the people she worked with, and journals, detailed observations about animal behavior, about the connections between different species. His voice grew stronger with the telling. She used to say that animals understood things about the world that humans had forgotten. Jennifer felt the world shifting beneath her feet. Mom was a wildlife researcher? But she never... Why didn't she ever tell me? Because she was pregnant with you when she came back from Kenya. Your father, your biological father, was a researcher she'd fallen in love with there. He died in a vehicle accident 2 weeks before she discovered she was pregnant. Frank's eyes met Jennifer's, full of love and understanding. I met your mother when she was 6 months along, working as a secretary to pay for medical bills. I fell in love with both of you before Jennifer was even born. The revelation hit Jennifer like a physical blow. Everything she thought she knew about her family, her heritage, her mother's quiet acceptance of Frank's practical Nebraska life, all of it reframed in an instant. You're not my biological father? I'm the father who chose you, Frank said firmly. Who loved you from the moment I first felt you kick in your mother's belly, who walked you down the aisle at your wedding and held Tyler the day he was born. Biology doesn't make a family, Jenny. Love does. Marcus watched this intimate family moment unfold, thinking of Jake and Sarah and the family that cancer and lions and grief had destroyed. He understood now why the lions had responded to Frank the way they had. The man carried Martha's legacy in his very cells, her scent, her memory, her decades of dreams about returning to the place where she had been happiest. There's more, Frank continued, his strength beginning to ebb again. Martha's research focused on emotional intelligence in lions, on their ability to form bonds across species lines. She documented cases of lions showing what could only be called empathy toward other animals, even toward humans who had helped them. He looked at Marcus. She would have understood what happened today. She spent her whole career trying to prove that the capacity for compassion exists throughout the animal kingdom. Jennifer sat in stunned silence, processing revelations that changed not just her understanding of her family history, but her entire worldview. Her mother, the quiet farmer's wife who had seemed content with small-town Nebraska life, had been a pioneering researcher whose work had contributed to conservation efforts that still protected wildlife today. Why didn't she ever go back? Jennifer asked. If Kenya meant so much to her, why did she settle for looking at pictures and reading National Geographic? Frank's smile was sad but peaceful. Because she had you, and then she had me. And she said that loving a family was just another form of conservation, protecting and nurturing something precious so it could grow and flourish. His voice dropped to a whisper. But she never stopped dreaming about going back. Never stopped believing that there was magic in that place, in those animals. As if summoned by the conversation, Dr. Ochieng appeared in the doorway with an expression that was both professional and bewildered. Mr. Patterson, there's been an unusual development. The Wildlife Veterinary Clinic has been calling all morning. It seems that the lions you encountered yesterday are still maintaining their vigil at the site where you collapsed. The veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, is requesting permission to document this behavior for research purposes. She says it's unprecedented in her 20 years of fieldwork. Frank closed his eyes, feeling Martha's presence as strongly as if she were sitting beside him. Through the hospital window, the Kenyan sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of Nebraska sunsets, of 47 years of shared evenings, of a love that had transcended species, geography, and now even death itself. "Tell Dr. Mitchell she has my permission," he said quietly, "and tell her that my wife would have been honored to contribute to her research even in this small way." 6 months later, Frank Patterson stood on the observation deck of the Mara Dreams Safari Lodge, watching the African sunrise paint the grasslands in shades of gold that reminded him of Martha's hair in their wedding photographs. The cancer was still there, would always be there, but the aggressive progression had mysteriously slowed after his encounter with Mfalma's pride. Dr. Ochieng called it unprecedented remission, though Frank preferred Martha's explanation from beyond the grave. Sometimes the heart finds reasons to keep beating that the mind can't understand. Jennifer stood beside him, her hand resting on Tyler's shoulder, as the 12-year-old boy documented everything through the expensive camera his grandfather had bought him. The family resemblance was startling now that Frank knew the truth about Jennifer's parentage. She had her biological father's intense focus and her mother's quiet determination, combined with something uniquely her own that Frank had nurtured for 45 years. "There," Tyler whispered, pointing toward a cluster of acacia trees near the river. "I see them." Mfalme emerged first, his distinctive dark mane catching the morning light as he surveyed his territory. The scar on his left leg was barely visible now, healed completely except for a thin line of lighter fur that would mark him forever as the lion who had trusted a dying human enough to accept help. Behind him came the 5 lionesses, including the scarred female who had become something of a local legend among the guides and researchers. "The veterinary team says his mobility is completely restored," Marcus said, joining the family on the deck. The former hunter had transformed himself into something Frank could never have imagined, a conservation photographer whose images of Mfalme's pride had appeared in National Geographic and sparked international discussions about animal cognition and emotional intelligence. No lasting damage from the trap. Tyler lowered his camera to look at Marcus with the unfettered curiosity of adolescence. "Do you think they remember Grandpa?" Marcus smiled, the expression so different from the grief-hardened mask he'd worn 6 months earlier. "Let's find out." The walk to the acacia grove where everything had changed took 20 minutes, long enough for Frank to rest twice and for Jennifer to question the wisdom of this pilgrimage. But Frank had insisted, and Dr. Mitchell, the wildlife veterinarian who had been documenting the pride's unusual behavior, had assured them it was safe with proper precautions. "They've shown no aggression toward humans since the incident," Dr. Mitchell had explained during their planning meeting. "If anything, they seem more tolerant of human presence than typical wild lions. It's one of several behavioral changes we've documented in the months since your father's encounter." As they approached the grove, Frank felt his heart rate increase, not from exertion or cancer fatigue, but from anticipation mixed with something approaching reverence. This place had become sacred to him, the spot where Martha's dreams had finally intersected with reality, where grief had transformed into something approaching grace. Mfalme noticed them first, his massive head turning in their direction with the alert attention of an apex predator. But instead of the defensive posture Frank had expected, the lion simply watched their approach with what could only be described as recognition. The 5 lionesses moved into formation around their leader, but it was protective positioning aimed outward, not toward the approaching humans. "Incredible," Dr. Mitchell whispered, her recording equipment capturing every detail. "They're treating you as part of their social structure. I've never seen wild lions behave this way with humans." Frank approached slowly, his hands visible and empty except for the small container holding the remaining half of Martha's ashes. He had carried her with him from Nebraska to Kenya and back to Boston, and now here again, completing a circle that had taken 45 years to close. When he was 20 feet from the Pride, Frank stopped and sat down on the same fallen log where he had collapsed 6 months earlier. The scarred lioness, whom Tyler had nicknamed Guardian, despite Dr. Mitchell's protests about anthropomorphizing wild animals, separated herself from the group and approached with deliberate steps. Jennifer tensed beside Frank, her medical training warring with the impossible scene unfolding before her. But Guardian's movements were calm, purposeful, almost ceremonial in their precision. She settled herself beside Frank exactly as she had during his medical crisis, her massive frame offering support and warmth. "Hello, beautiful," Frank said softly, his hand settling on her head with the same natural ease he'd once shown petting farm cats. "I brought someone for you to meet." He opened Martha's urn, his arthritic fingers careful with the precious contents. "This is my wife, Martha. She spent her whole life loving your kind from afar. She would have been honored to rest here, among the lions she dreamed about for 40 years. The wind that swept across the grassland as Frank scattered Martha's ashes seemed to carry her essence into the very heart of the place she had always considered home. Mphalma approached then, his golden eyes meeting Frank's with the same impossible recognition that had defined their first encounter. The massive lion lowered his head, and for a moment that defied every law of wild animal behavior, he allowed Frank to rest his hand on the dark mane. Tyler's camera clicked rapidly, documenting a moment that would eventually grace the cover of Martha's posthumously published research journals that Jennifer had discovered in the attic, complete with observations that anticipated contemporary animal cognition research by decades. "She knew," Frank said, his voice carrying across the grove to where Marcus stood with his own camera, tears streaming down his cheeks as he documented the scene. "Martha always knew that the capacity for love exists everywhere. We're brave enough to look for it." The Pride remained with them for another hour, the lions resting in companionable silence while the humans sat among them like honored guests. Tyler asked whispered questions about lion behavior that Dr. Mitchell answered with increasing excitement about her research findings. Jennifer held her father's hand and marveled at the convergence of family history and impossible present that had brought them all to this moment. As they prepared to leave, Guardian performed one final act that would be debated in wildlife behavior journals for years to come. She approached the spot where Frank had scattered Martha's ashes and lay down, her body forming a protective circle around the base of the acacia tree. The other lionesses joined her, and finally Mphalme, until the entire Pride had created a living monument to a woman who had devoted her life to understanding and protecting their kind. "They'll move on eventually," Dr. Mitchell said as they walked back toward the lodge. "But they've been visiting this spot regularly for months, almost like they're maintaining some kind of shrine." Frank smiled, feeling lighter than he had since Martha's diagnosis 2 years earlier. She would have loved that. Martha always said that love recognizes love, no matter what form it takes. That evening, as the family prepared for their return flight to Boston, Tyler approached his grandfather with the carefully serious expression he wore for important conversations. "Grandpa, are you going to be okay?" Frank pulled his grandson close, breathing in the scent of adventure and possibility that seemed to cling to the boy after their week in Kenya. "I'm going to be exactly what I need to be, Tyler, for as long as I need to be it. And you'll tell me more stories about Grandma Martha's research? Every story I know. And maybe we'll come back here someday, so you can tell your own children about the lions who taught us that love knows no boundaries." Frank Patterson's story reminds us that our most meaningful chapters often begin when we think our story is ending. At 72, facing terminal cancer and crushing loneliness after losing his beloved Martha, Frank could have simply waited to die. Instead, he chose to honor his wife's dreams by traveling to Kenya, a decision that led to an extraordinary encounter with a pride of lions and a discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about love, family, and purpose. When Frank freed that trapped lion, he didn't just save Mafalmi's life, he rediscovered his own reason for living. The lion's unprecedented response, protecting Frank and maintaining a vigil at the spot where he collapsed, defied everything science tells us about wild animal behavior. But perhaps that's the point. Love transcends species, age, and even death itself. Frank's journey from despair to wonder, from isolation to connection, proves that it's never too late to find something beautiful to believe in again. His relationship with his daughter Jennifer deepened. His grandson Tyler discovered a passion for wildlife conservation, and even Marcus, the grief-stricken hunter, found redemption through compassion. Sometimes the most extraordinary adventures await us in our golden years when we finally have the wisdom to recognize that healing is always possible. Share your thoughts. Have you ever experienced an unexpected moment of connection with an animal that changed your perspective? What dreams from your younger years are you still hoping to fulfill? Tell us in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to take that leap of faith.